It's just a worn-out fishing boat, let it go. The yacht owner chuckled as the massive hull of his vessel collided with and crushed the veteran's craft. No one stepped in to assist. No one even offered an apology. The American flag that had flown proudly on the weather-faded boat slipped into the harbor, shredded and drifting. But by the next sunrise, a hush fell over the entire harbor. 6 Navy ships appeared on the horizon, pulling in without ceremony. Their flags hung at half-mast. No announcement. No speeches. Just silent arrival. Who were they here for? What memory had the sea decided to honor? Still believe kindness circles back when you least expect it? Drop your thoughts below. Welcome to Uncovered Tales. Let's explore what really happened. Arthur Kane, 72, had lived quietly in Harborside for as long as most locals could remember. Nearly every morning, long before the sun crested the waves, he was already out on the water. His rough, weather-worn hands would guide the wooden boat he'd built himself after returning from war. In a seaside town increasingly consumed by high-end condos and tourist yachts, Arthur was a relic of another era, admired by a few, ignored by many. His boat, Liberty Child, didn't draw much attention. The paint had long since faded from decades of sun and salt air. The wooden hull moaned with age, telling stories through every creak. But it was strong, crafted by someone who knew that true beauty doesn't scream for attention. Arthur had built her board by board after returning from Vietnam, using the steady rhythm of woodworking to keep the war's echoes at bay. People in town didn't know much about his time in uniform. He rarely spoke of it. All they knew was that he'd once been in the Navy, and that, on quiet nights, you could sometimes hear his screams from across the water when he slept on the boat. That Wednesday began like so many others. Arthur was on the water by 5 a.m. planning to check his crab traps and catch the sunrise near the harbor's mouth. He had just finished tying off his mooring when he caught the deep, unmistakable rumble of powerful engines. Then came Ovida, a gleaming white giant, cutting through the water like royalty. 600 tons of sleek Italian luxury, gliding forward with an air of entitlement. At the helm stood Chase Morgan, a 38-year-old tech mogul who'd recently bought the biggest beachfront estate in town. Arthur had seen his face in the local paper, where people called him the savior of Harborside's economy. Arthur waved both arms, trying to make himself visible. The yacht didn't slow. "Hey! I'm moored here," he shouted. But his voice was no match for the drone of the engines. Up on the top deck, Morgan and his friends toasted champagne, laughing among themselves, either unaware or uninterested in the small wooden vessel directly in their path. The harbor patrol boat floated nearby. The officer inside looked concerned, but didn't move a muscle. Then came the sound, one that Arthur would never forget. A sharp, gut-wrenching crack. Liberty Child's stern crumbled under the force of the yacht's bow, wood splintering like dry twigs beneath steel and fiberglass. Arthur barely managed to leap out of the way, landing hard on the dock. He could only watch as his boat, his labor of love, his escape, his floating home, was torn apart in front of him. The American flag he had raised every day for 40 years broke loose. It tumbled into the churned water, its red stripes bleeding into the foam. Only then did the yacht's engines finally stop. In the eerie silence that followed, Morgan's irritated voice echoed across the harbor. "It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it." Arthur rose slowly, joints groaning in protest. A small crowd had gathered, early joggers, dock workers, curious tourists with their phones up, recording. Not a single person offered a hand. The harbor security officer walked over, hesitantly. "Mr. Kane. I'll need to file a report." But Arthur wasn't listening. His eyes had locked onto something drifting, his flag. Torn. Waterlogged. He limped along the edge of the dock, shoulders tight with pain, until he could reach down and pull the sodden fabric from the water. He held it against his chest, soaking his shirt, treating it with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for lost brothers in arms. When he looked back at the crowd, there was no fury in his expression, no accusation. Just a solemn dignity that made people look away, ashamed. "Nice boat," Morgan called out again from his deck. His voice, soaked in mockery, cut through the still morning air. "Maybe it's time for an upgrade, old-timer. Everything expires eventually." Arthur didn't answer. He simply gathered the wet flag and turned his back on the scene, walking away upright despite the ache in his bones, steady despite the trembling in his hands. Behind him, someone snorted. A phone pinged. The first video had gone live. Its caption read, "Old man. Old boat. Old news." By midday, the harbor had returned to its usual rhythm. What remained of Liberty Child had already been hauled away, out of sight, out of mind. Just another inconvenience erased. A mess cleaned up. To most, it was nothing more than visual clutter, cleared, forgotten. Online, the video continued to circulate. People scrolled past it on their lunch breaks, many pausing only long enough to type LOL before moving on with their day. Not one mentioned the tears that had glimmered in Arthur Kane's eyes, tears that never quite fell, held back by something older than pride. Arthur's house sat quietly on a bluff above the harbor, a humble little cottage he'd bought decades ago with his Navy pension, back before beachfront property was priced for millionaires. Through the front window, he had witnessed the slow transformation of the town, once a working harbor, now a playground for the wealthy. The shift had been steady and unstoppable, like the tide that shaped the coastline without asking permission. That evening, he sat alone at his kitchen table, a wooden chest resting open before him. Inside were the small remnants of a life shaped by service, black and white photos of young sailors with steady eyes, official letters aged to a soft yellow, and dog tags that had once pressed against his chest through stormy nights and endless watches. At the bottom of the chest, carefully folded and still crisp, lay another flag, an untouched one, given to him when he'd retired from active duty. Its stars gleamed quietly under the kitchen light. Standing in the doorway was Ben, Arthur's grandson, home on break from college. He watched in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You're going to sue them, right, Grandpa? That guy wrecked your boat. He should pay for it." Arthur slowly shook his head, his fingertips lightly brushing the embroidered stars on the folded flag. "He didn't damage me," he said in a low voice. "He just destroyed something nobody ever really cared about." Ben's face tightened. His sense of justice, still sharp and youthful, burned with more heat than his grandfather's quiet resolve. "But you built that boat," he insisted. "It meant something." Arthur gave a small nod. "Yes," he replied. "It meant something, to me." Later that night, after Ben had gone to bed, Arthur pulled out his old logbook. For 4 decades, it had been his ritual, recording the tides, the weather, his catches, the moods of the sea. But that evening, all he wrote was, "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences. But the ocean still calls." He closed the book and turned on the television. The local news played footage of Morgan's yacht, praising it as the largest private vessel ever to dock in Harborside. No mention was made of what happened that morning. Meanwhile, the internet kept buzzing. The video had gone viral. Most comments sided with Morgan. That boat was an eyesore. Boomers need to learn when to quit. Why not upgrade to something modern already? That afternoon, the harbor master had called. His tone was flat, professional, rehearsed. "Mr. Kane, your vessel wasn't fitted with radar reflectors or compliant lighting. It didn't meet current codes. Unfortunately, the insurance won't cover the damages." Arthur had said nothing. When the man finished, he hung up. He didn't bother mentioning that Liberty Child had been grandfathered under older regulations. Didn't remind him that in 40 years, he had passed every inspection without fail. Why waste the breath? The boat was gone. The sea had reclaimed what he had only ever borrowed from it. That's just how things work sometimes. Still, as Arthur stood on his porch that night, staring out at the harbor, the emptiness gnawed at him like a missing limb. It wasn't just the timber or the torn canvas that haunted him. It was the loss of early mornings spent watching dolphins cut through the still water. Evenings where the boat's gentle rocking lulled him into dreamless sleep. The one place where war couldn't chase him, where the sea's rhythm could wash away memories of gunfire and screams. From where he stood, he could see Elvira glowing like a floating palace, music and laughter spilling into the night air. Life, it seemed, had continued without pause. The wealthy celebrated with wine and fireworks, while one old man grieved in silence. Arthur didn't resent their joy. He had witnessed enough pain in this world to understand the importance of happiness where you could find it. He only wished they understood what had been lost. Not just a boat, but a way of living that honored stillness. A bond with the ocean that wasn't about conquering, but respecting. In the moonlight, he unfolded his service flag and laid it across the porch railing, letting the sea breeze lift its edges, as if the ocean itself remembered him. At dawn, he woke out of habit. His hand reached for the boat keys that were no longer there. And that hollow space in his chest stretched wider, until it seemed to echo through the quiet room. For the first time in 40 years, he had nowhere to go when the stars began to fade. He didn't demand justice. He didn't raise his voice. But some things still deserved to be heard. But if there was one thing he still deserved, it was respect. If you believe that honor isn't something money can buy, type honor below. A thick blanket of fog hung over Harborside that morning, soft and pearly, veiling the harbor's entrance like a drawn curtain. Arthur sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, staring quietly into the white mist that blurred the line between sea and land. Ever since Liberty Child had been lost, his routine hadn't changed much. He still rose before dawn. He still kept sailor's hours. Only now, there was nowhere to go. He was like a captain with no ship, adrift on dry land. Then came the first sign that something was off. The harbor's foghorn let out 3 long, echoing blasts, low and resonant, slicing through the stillness. Arthur straightened in his seat, his old instincts kicking in. He knew that signal. It meant something big was coming in. From within the fog, shadows began to emerge, large, moving with purpose. They cut through the harbor waters in perfect formation. 6 Navy ships, lined up with military precision. Their silhouettes slowly sharpened as they drew closer. There had been no warnings. No press. No event scheduled. Not even a whisper of what was about to happen. And the most haunting part? Silence. No ceremonial salutes. No blaring horns. Just the quiet weight of something sacred. On each ship, the American flag flew low, at half-mast. Not for a public holiday. But for someone. Word spread like wildfire. Storefronts flipped their signs to closed. Shopkeepers, baristas, fishermen, everyone left what they were doing and rushed to the waterfront. Children were released early from summer programs, their voices hushed by parents who didn't know what was happening, but knew it mattered. Arthur watched from his porch, his brows furrowed in confusion. There had been no mention of naval exercises. No VIPs visiting town. What were they doing here? The lead ship, a guided missile destroyer, eased up to the dock with practiced grace. On deck stood Rear Admiral Alan Porter, his dress whites crisp, posture firm, expression solemn. In his gloved hands, he held a folded American flag, that triangle of stars and blue, creased with ritual care. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. He knew that fold by heart. He'd performed it countless times during his years in service. That fold meant someone had given everything. Painfully aware of his aging joints, Arthur rose from his chair and began walking, still dressed in civilian clothes, but moving with the quiet purpose of a man who understood what this meant. The crowd instinctively stepped aside as he approached. They didn't know why, but something in his posture, his face, his silence told them this moment was his. Admiral Porter saw him and stepped down from the ship's gangway, his salute snapping crisply into place. "Chief Petty Officer Kane," he called out, his voice carrying across the harbor's hush. "Permission to come ashore and render honors." Arthur's hand rose in response, reflex, not thought. The gesture still lived in his bones. "Permission granted, Admiral," he answered, steadier than he expected. Porter descended, followed closely by a full-color guard. All along the decks of the 6 ships, sailors stood at attention, turned toward shore. 43 years ago, the Admiral began, addressing the assembled crowd. This man prevented a catastrophic disaster aboard the USS Constellation when a cooling unit burst during a violent storm in the South China Sea. He sealed off the flooded compartment with his bare hands, suffering burns over 60% of his body in the process. His actions stopped lethal gases from reaching the sleeping quarters, where 128 sailors were resting, unaware of the danger. A hushed murmur swept through the crowd. People turned to Arthur with a new kind of gaze, one of realization. For the first time, they noticed the faint white scars that peeked out from beneath his collar. "Chief Kane never spoke of what he did," Porter continued. "He turned down the Navy Cross. All he asked was that the Navy look after the boys who didn't come home. He's lived among you for 4 decades, quietly, humbly, never asking for recognition." Then Porter's eyes drifted across the harbor, settling momentarily on the opulent yacht where Chase Morgan and his guests stood watching. Yesterday, this man's vessel, Liberty Child, was destroyed right here in this harbor. No one offered help. No one offered respect. The flag he had flown every day was left to sink. A young sailor stepped forward, holding something in his hands, a polished wooden plaque. He approached Arthur slowly, respectfully, and bowed before handing it to him. Arthur looked down at the inscription. A brass plate, salvaged from a decommissioned ship, bore the engraving. "For the man who kept the sea safe, even after service." "The United States Navy does not forget its own," the Admiral said firmly. "We are here today to honor Chief Petty Officer Arthur Kane, and to affirm that his service didn't end the day he folded up his uniform." All along the shoreline, sailors raised their hands in salute. The color guard lifted their flags high. And for the first time in far too long, Harborside remembered who Arthur Kane was. In that moment, it wasn't just a fleet of 6 ships arriving, it felt like the weight of an entire tradition anchoring itself in the harbor. The full force of naval brotherhood, loyalty, and respect had come ashore. Someone in the crowd lifted their phone and started live-streaming the ceremony. Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire across social media. The same platforms that had mocked Arthur just the day before now began telling a very different story. The trending hashtag #BoomerOwn, which had accompanied the clip of his boat being destroyed, quickly gave way to a new one, #VeteranSalute. Comments poured in by the second, many from the same people who'd ridiculed him only hours earlier. Now their messages were filled with remorse. "I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell us he was a hero? This is what service really looks like." Back on Levita, Jack Morgan remained silent. For once, he looked like he didn't have anything clever to say. His guests had gone quiet too, champagne glasses set down, no longer part of the celebration. They simply watched. After the formal presentation ended, Admiral Porter approached Arthur quietly. "We heard what happened from your grandson," he said. "Ben reached out to the Navy Alumni Association. Why didn't you call us yourself, Chief?" Arthur gave a small shrug. "Didn't seem like your problem, sir. It was just a boat." Porter shook his head with quiet conviction. "No, Kane. It was never just a boat. And you? You were never just a sailor." He looked out over the harbor for a moment, his voice softening. "Some debts, they can't ever be paid in full." As the ceremony wrapped up and people began to drift away, something unexpected started to happen. One by one, townsfolk, many of whom hadn't spoken to Arthur in years, approached him. Some offered a handshake. Others, a quiet thank you. More than a few offered apologies, eyes downcast. Then came the harbor master, holding out a document. "Fishing permits," he said, smiling. "No expiration. Yours for life." Not long after, the marina owner stepped up. "We've got a slip for you, no charge. For whatever boat you decide to bring in next." Arthur accepted it all with the same calm grace he'd shown the day his boat was destroyed. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand gestures from him. But if you looked close enough, you'd notice something had shifted in his eyes. It wasn't pride. It wasn't vindication. It was something deeper. Recognition. After decades of silence, Arthur Kane had finally been seen. 1 week later, at the spot where Liberty Child had always rested, a quiet dedication ceremony was held. In her place now stood a simple stone marker. It read, "Liberty Child, a boat that carried more than one life." The town council had approved the tribute unanimously. Several members admitted, with tears in their eyes, that they'd never truly known the man who had been part of their town for so long. And the harbor? It began to change, not overnight, but steadily. Tourists who once breezed past Arthur without so much as a glance now stopped to read the plaque. They stood still, taking in his story. Some lingered. Some left quietly moved. Local fishermen, long pushed to the fringes by expensive yachts and charters, began to feel a shift too. People started giving them room at the docks. They listened when they spoke. They asked about currents, nets, tides. They started seeing them again. But perhaps the most touching change came from the youngest residents of Harborside. Children who had once been told to stay away from the grizzled old mariners now gathered after school, drawn to the docks by stories, by laughter, by the kind of wisdom you couldn't find on a screen. That afternoon, Arthur sat on a freshly installed bench overlooking his old mooring spot. A small crowd of kids huddled around him, their eyes wide as he demonstrated the art of tying nautical knots. His calloused hands, though worn with age, moved deftly, rope twisting into patterns that had once kept vessels steady through the worst of storms. "This one's called a bowline," he told them with a small smile. "It's been saving lives since long before Columbus even knew where he was going." A little girl named Emma, maybe 7 years old, watched intently, her brow furrowed as she followed his movements. Suddenly, she looked up and asked the kind of blunt question only a child would dare. "Are you mad at the man who broke your boat?" Arthur paused, her question settling over him like a soft fog. He looked at her, then at the knot in her small hands. "No," he said after a beat. "Because if it weren't for him, maybe no one would have ever remembered that boat even existed." The children nodded slowly, absorbing his words with the kind of deep understanding that often escapes adults. Later that same day, Arthur had a visitor he hadn't expected. Jack Morgan stood a few steps away on the dock, alone for once, his designer sunglasses pushed up on his head. He looked unsure of himself, out of place, away from his crowd, stripped of his usual swagger. "Mr. Kane," he began, his voice unusually quiet. "Mr. Kane," Jack Morgan began, then hesitated, clearly uncomfortable in a conversation that offered him no script. "I came here to apologize. There's no excuse for how I acted." Arthur gave a slight nod but said nothing, his silence asking more than words could. Morgan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I want to make this right," he said, holding it out. "It's a blank check. Whatever you think your boat, and my actions, are worth, just write the number." Arthur glanced at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Money can't put back what's gone," he said quietly. Morgan's voice cracked just enough to sound real. "Then tell me what can." His polished exterior gave way to something raw. "I've been a complete ass, and now the whole country sees me as the guy who destroyed a hero's boat. Just, tell me how to fix this." Arthur studied him for a long moment. "There's a spot on the eastern pier," he said at last. It catches the sunrise. Put a bench there. Make it sturdy. Something that will last. Carve 3 words into it, sit. Remember. Thank. Morgan blinked, visibly surprised. That's it? Just a bench? Arthur looked back out over the water, voice soft but firm. Sometimes, he said, what people need most, is a quiet place to remember what matters. 2 days later, a woodworker from Seattle arrived with a hand-carved teak bench, just as Arthur had described. It was installed facing east, precisely at the spot he'd mentioned. The 3 words were set in bronze, designed to weather with the sea air, but never fade. Morgan showed up too, no cameras, no entourage, just work gloves and a quiet resolve. He helped install the bench himself, even when his palms blistered from the effort. Word of Arthur's request spread fast. The story hit national news with a headline that read, "Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench instead." Some debated whether he'd been too forgiving. Others called him a symbol of quiet wisdom. Veterans groups shared his story as a living example of service, humility, and the things that truly matter. Arthur, however, avoided the spotlight. He slipped back into his usual rhythm, not fishing, but teaching. Without Liberty Child, he could no longer bring in fresh fish for the community kitchen as he'd done for years. But he offered something else now, something just as valuable. Time. Patience. And the wisdom you only earn by living in tune with the sea. About a month later, Admiral Porter returned. No fanfare this time. He came alone, dressed casually, pulling into town in a modest car. He found Arthur at the dock, showing 2 boys how to splice line. "The Secretary of the Navy has a proposal for you," Porter said after greeting him. "We're expanding a youth maritime program. Seamanship, navigation, environmental stewardship. We need teachers who know the sea, and know how to reach kids." Arthur raised an eyebrow, half amused. "Admiral, I'm not exactly spry anymore." Porter chuckled. "Tell that to the pack of kids who follow you around like ducklings. The position's yours if you want it. Part-time. Flexible hours. Not bad pay either." Before Arthur could answer, a commotion at the harbor caught both men's attention. A small boat was being towed in, brand new, but with a classic silhouette that echoed the past. Its name, freshly painted on the stern, glistened in the sunlight. Liberty's Child. The entire town poured onto the docks to greet her. At the helm stood Ben, beaming. "Surprise, Grandpa," he called out. "We all worked on it. Found your old plans in the shed. The Boat Builders Association donated the materials. Veterans came from 4 different states to help build it." Arthur stood motionless, his expression softening into something raw and quiet. The boat wasn't identical, but the spirit was unmistakably hers. "We updated a few things," Ben said as he tied the mooring lines. "Safety features, a better NAV system. But the heart? That's still yours. You may not have built it this time, but you designed it." Arthur stepped onto the deck with the ease of a man returning home. His body responded instinctively, feet adjusting to the sway, hands brushing the polished rail. At the bow, a brand new American flag snapped smartly in the breeze. "For a man who kept the faith," Ben said softly. Even when it seemed no one was paying attention. That evening, as the sun melted into the sea and the harbor turned gold, Arthur sat on the bench Morgan had installed. Fishing boats pulled in one by one. A couple walking by stopped to read the 3 words etched into the wood. Their young son looked up and asked, "What does it mean?" The father replied, "It means we should stop every now and then, and remember the people who made our lives possible." Arthur smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon where sky met sea. In a world obsessed with moving faster, he had become a quiet symbol of looking back, not with regret, but with reverence. His new boat would sail the same waters. Different wood, same compass. The same values guided her. Steady in storms. Always ready to help. Brave when it matters most. He never asked for justice. He never raised his voice. He simply picked up his flag, and walked away. But the next morning, the sea remembered him. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where honor is remembered, and silence never wins.